until you're ready.
Perfect.
Then you just turn it over and it's off.
Thank you so much.
Some Tasmanian friends. This is Fernando.
Okay.
He's studying at Parsons. This is the friend from London, Will.
Oh.
And then his girlfriend's here as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, my sister's back there.
Oh, really?
That's my sister. And two of my closest friends,
Oh,
Justine and Leslie.
nice.
Yeah.
Support.
Yeah, it's nice. Just fill the room with your loved ones, and then how can you go wrong?
Nothing good, don't say it.
Right.
So I'm going to give it like maybe 5 more minutes or so. My sister's not here. She's supposed to bring the water. What? Oh, yeah, thanks.
that mean? You can't see us?
Maybe they can only hear. I just wrote people in the room. I'm gonna give it like another minute or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they can, it sounds like the live feed, they can hear us, but they cannot see us.
I don't know. I mean, I know that it's, he said the screen's going in. I don't know. I don't know.
He said you can see the room, and I said, people in the room? And he didn't.
We could call that guy in.
I mean, how important is it to you?
I mean, it just would be nice if it makes sense.
I know. Who did he?
Maybe Ruthie knows if there's like a. There must be like.
Ask her. Hello? Yeah. Can you see me talking to you? Oh, okay, great. All right, love you. Okay, great. No, we're all set. Okay, great. All right, I gotta go. Bye.
Hello?
We're all set. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, but if we wait for my sister.
Yeah.
So good evening. Thank you all so much for coming out the week of what we'll call an unnamed long weekend coming up. I really appreciate it. My name is Lucia Trimber. I'm an associate professor of sociology at John Jay College and here at the Graduate Center. Before we start, I want to go over a few logistics. One is that we're being taped, and there's a live feed. So choose what secrets you divulge accordingly, so that you are not sorry later. The second thing that I want to say is that I think a lot of us are really pretty aware of the fact that the verdict on Michael Brown's shooting is going to come out any minute now. I have my phone set so that I get a text. And I think we'll just sort of have to go with that as that happens, and to acknowledge that and to honor Michael Brown's death. His parents have asked for a 4.5-minute moment of silence after the verdict is given for the 4.5 hours that his body lay in the street, and I would like to do that when that verdict comes in. For those of you who want to know a next step as this comes in, I urge you to go to fergusonresponse.tumblr.com, which gives a list of actions, collective actions all around the country in response to, I think, what many of us think will be a decision not to indict. So, as I attempt to transition, thank you again for coming out tonight and for supporting this event. As I've learned very quickly, when you attempt to put an event like this on, you realize just how many people contribute in both big and small ways. Hillary Clinton would tell us it takes a village, and Hillary Clinton may be right in this one case. So I have to thank first the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics for their support and for hosting us in one, if not the most coveted rooms in the Graduate Center, the Skylight Room. So many thanks to Mary Taylor, who's the Assistant Director of the Center, and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Director of the Center. Thank you. John Jay College's Office for the Advancement of Research and John Jay College's Department of Sociology provided funding for James to come here and to to share his wisdom in a residency. I thank them. And John Jay's Performance and Justice series, which is a really fantastic series that I encourage. Dr. Apatow is in the audience, and she's participated in it. It's run out of the Theater and Communications Department at John Jay. Is phenomenal, and they've given me a lot of assistance and helped this project materialize as well. So I thank Rick Curtis, Dave Brotherton, Seth Bauman, and the amazing Nasima Waz, who is not here. She's going to come at 7, so when she comes in, just say, "You were thanked," so she knows. Also, John Chianese, I think that's how he pronounces it, from Audiovisual, worked like magic. He sort of went poof and things came on the screen. So part of this, the prehistory of this talk, is a visit that I did about 2 years ago at a place called Montmartre, which is an independent study program for artists and an artist in residence program, which also runs a small gallery in Lisbon, Portugal. And my getting to Montmartre, which is where I met James, was facilitated by, once again, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, as well as Craig Gilmore, which he's changed seats. So I thank you, and I also thank Jürgen Bach for that invitation. And finally, I want to thank my co-panelists, James Newitt and Genevieve Broussard, so much for helping me co-develop this event. It was a team effort. I even got James saying "Go team" at the end, which was sort of like one of my goals at the beginning of this project. And it's just been a complete delight to be able to collaborate with you. And I really appreciate that you didn't give up on me when I had wacky ideas. You just sort of calmly said, "Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Maybe we could try this." So I want to talk a little bit about how this panel came about. And then I'll sort of turn into the more formal part of tonight's programming. It's hard to know where to start, where to describe how this panel came together. It stretches over a decade and across several continents. I first met Genevieve in 2003 when she was boxing competitively, and I might add, easily taking down her opponents one by one. I knew her socially first, and then over time, she was kind enough to teach me an incredible amount about her craft. And as I was writing my book on boxing, Genevieve offered tremendously helpful comments. James Newitt and I began a rigorous dialogue about ethnographic and artistic practice several months after my visit to Montmartre in 2013. When he was beginning to do research at a boxing gym in Lisbon. And I was lucky enough to watch his exhibition, which is called A Sort of Shadow, actualize over a period of 5 months. So through emails, field notes, mind maps, Skype calls, carrier pigeons, smoke signals, and then what amounted to 60,000 words of exchange, I was able to see his curious thinking and his creative processes at work. And then Genevieve and James came together not only through my urgings, but then through a Portuguese artist in Genevieve's PhD program at Goldsmiths College in London, who knew James. So when the three of us began corresponding about this event, we realized that we were interested in many of the same questions, but from very different vantage points, from different disciplinary frameworks, from very different theoretical interventions and critical methodologies. And what we want to explore tonight, and invite you to explore with us, is what kinds of questions, what types of questions are generated through an intense and sustained relationship to the sport of boxing? What are the ethics and the modes of representation of boxing and of boxers? And how can we make the subject inconclusive as to allow multiple identity formations, multiple subject positions, and multiple possible futures? So I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've done over the past decade and how it intersects with James' thinking. Then we'll move down the table making connections as we go so that we loop back to Genev's links with James's work as we close out the panel. So before I begin my sort of formal part, let me tell you a little bit about the talented artists and scholars at the table. James Newitt is an artist and lecturer in fine arts at the Tasmanian College of the Arts, where he completed a doctoral degree in 2008. James's work explores specific social and cultural relations, often embracing mutability and paradox. His videos and installations investigate the spaces between the individual and collective identity, memory and history, fact and fiction, through personal, observational, and performative approaches. James has exhibited extensively in group and solo exhibitions throughout Australia and Europe. Geneve Brassard is an artist, educator, and researcher with an international record of exhibitions at venues such as Kentler Drawing Space and Frere, is it Frere? Has worked at the City Library. She contributes to a variety of publications, including Texter Kunst, excuse my German, and N+1. She's a 2000 New York City teaching fellow and has been working in public art education for 15 years. She's currently finalizing her PhD in art practice at Goldsmiths College, London. And she's an incredible boxer. So she's competed internationally as an amateur. She's a 2-time New York City Golden Gloves champion, a 3-time Metro Games champion, and a 3-time Empire State champion, and she was nationally ranked as number 4. I'm just Lucia Trember. I'm an associate professor, as I said before, sociology here and at John Jay. So now I'm going to move. We decided we wanted to do a sort of anti-hierarchical thing, so I'm going to move to sit down here so that we go through. This is my sort of, that part of me is now concluded. So I'm going to talk about my research. I began doing research at Gleason's Gym, which is a boxing gym in Brooklyn, in 2001. I was interested in women's integration into the sport and into the historically masculine space of urban boxing gyms. And I decided to go to Gleason's because it was one of the first gyms in New York City to offer women memberships, and women were invited more so than other gyms to train there. But it took me really one trip to Gleason's to realize that there was far more going on than women's integration into the sport, that there were many social phenomenon that were being woven in and out of the gym's 4 rings that I wanted to pursue in a research plan. So after one visit, my research dramatically expanded in scope, and I began to see that the gym was a place that was really starting to buffer a lot of the changes of post-industrial New York. So what was going on outside the gym was often being dealt with in the gym, which was often being negotiated and contested within the space of the gym, and that intrigued me. So historically, the urban gym has been frequented almost exclusively by competitive male boxers of color, trainers, and other men of the pugilistic industry. Boxers train for competition, and trainers work with their fighters early in the morning before work or late in the evening after punching out. But over the past 4 decades, Gleason's Gym, and a number of other gyms as well, has changed dramatically. So in the 1980s, the gym welcomed 2 new groups of boxers, women and a group called white-collar clients. So this group of white-collar clients are wealthy, they tend to be white, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, who pay significant amounts of money for their exercise with trainers who they believe are authentic. The income from these 2 new groups, women and white-collar clients, has allowed trainers to forfeit employment outside of the gym and work in Gleason's full-time. Half of the living in the gym. Today, the gym has 1,000+ members, roughly 80 trainers, 450 amateur and professional fighters, 300 female pugilists, and 300 male white-collar clients. So not surprisingly, as the membership of these two contingents in particular grew, the urban gym transformed. New social practices, social relations, and relations of power emerged, while novel spaces of interracial, interclass, and intergender contact and communication were created. The meetings that the sport held for its practitioners diversified. And so for me, the goal was to make sense of these different uses, experiences, spaces, power relations, and to figure out if and how these were all working together. So I suppose what I considered intriguing as an ethnographer is the contrast, is the difference, the different ways people were using the gym. I was also interested in how people came together to make a gym and a gym space that is very different than gyms of the past. And of course, I was interested in what these uses said about larger social structures and hierarchies. So what do these different groups of people get out of the gym? What I argue is that what unites these groups is that they're all responding to changing post-industrial circumstances. So they all go to the gym to create work, to develop a sense of self-worth, to consume, and to process their social worlds, although this is done in very different ways. So for amateur boxers, who tend to be men of color with limited means and modest educational backgrounds, who have also been all but shut out of a restricted market, forcibly confined in the U.S.'s massive prison industrial complex, the gym offers a place to improvise work that provides opportunities building identity, intimate social relations with other men. This work, and I do mean work in the formal sense, departs from conventional social scientific understandings of the concept in many sociological schema. The social and psychological features of work and the economic sustenance it provides are co-constituting. While some of these social and psychological effects and benefits may accrue with material recompense in some forms of labor, the connection doesn't hold true in Gleason's. Rather, for amateur boxers, the sort of work that pays the bills, when available, rarely delivers the potential for recognition, status, and dignity, as well as the sociality of the gym that amateurs cherish and seek in that space. Conversely, whatever social and cultural capital or moral and emotional fulfillment participants achieve from training their bodies is not a product of any sort of economic gain. For gym trainers, Gleason's offers a livelihood, again in a very restrictive post-industrial labor market. And yet here the notions of labor and identity, once again, are troubled. So even the work relationships that most closely adhere to what we might consider a quote-unquote traditional economic transaction, namely that between trainers and white-collar clients, where there are overt monetary exchanges, these are actually made possible by the other non-traditional work relationships. So what am I saying? The phenomenon of white-collar boxing at Gleason's is driven by the cultural cachet, attended by no small amount of racial stereotyping, of training in proximity to amateurs, working without wages, and in a gym with a revered and hardcore boxing reputation. And it's that reputation that's bolstered by the presence of those so committed to the sport that they'll do it without getting paid full-time. With the advent of Title IX and the opening up of women's sports, female boxers have marched into urban gyms such as Gleason's, which historically had banned them, to claim their right to engage in pugilistic exercises and to develop attendant identities and social relations. Often met with sexism, sexual advances, indifference, and ridicule, they generate their own possibilities from the sport. Through their training, they find out who they are, learn to defend themselves, and discover how to trust themselves. The selves they craft are strong, certain, and rooted in an intimate knowledge of their bodies and their minds. For these women, rehearsing and enduring violent encounters in the safe and controlled space of the gym can help some women understand violence and prepare for its arbitrary unleashing. And finally, white-collar clients, or the nouveau clientele, as it's often called, I guess like making it sound French makes it sound a little bit more exciting, who have benefited from post-industrial's social but primarily economic arrangements, have turned their attention to consumption and their gaze to their bodies. They don't always engage in the same pugilistic rituals as competitive boxers, but they too create these possibilities. So with anxiety about their masculinity and their substantial amounts of money, they fuel the political economy of white-collar boxing. So they'll often say that they feel emasculated by their millions and billions of dollars. And while this economic arrangement reveals the entrepreneurial impulses of gym trainers who have really cultivated these relationships in order to make a livelihood and to create a customer base, it also illuminates some of the ways that wealthy white men imagine low-income black men. So with a multiplicity of new meanings of blackness circulating in the post-industrial economy, white-collar clients have novel resources in which to actively construct a specific racial and gender identity in their workouts with gym trainers. So when clients employ quote-unquote authentic black trainers to coach them, they fashion and commodify a concept of blackness that is primarily corporeal. It's defined by narratives of racial subjugation and criminal pasts. In white-collar boxing, blackness is a form of cultural capital that is valued and bought. And these particular pugilistic practitioners then generate instances of misrecognition and preclude opportunities for conviviality when they see their trainers in this way. So gym members use boxing training to answer back to forms of inequality such as anti-black racism, class stratification, gender subordination, while others use capital from new markets to forge identities and to entertain themselves. Each group invests its own meaning in the gym's culture, undertakes boxing in various ways, and produces new lived experiences. However, there are limitations to this meaning-making. It helps people mediate the injuries of racial, class, and gender hierarchies, but it doesn't change those hierarchies outside of the gym. Instead, it operates within them. This, I argue, is the contemporary landscape of post-industrial New York, offering poor men of color, middle-class women, wealthy white-collar men, the ephemeral possibilities of new identities at the same time that it packages and commodifies their lived experience. So how does this connect up with James? This is my project, so now sort of transitioning to the work with James. When James and I started corresponding, it was clear that we shared an interest in how people negotiate their social circumstances. And because he was working in and working out in a boxing gym, we had a similar object and subjects from which to think through connections. Over the months, we realized we shared the same curiosity about what lies in between representation and marginality, or what I've been trying to show here is lived experience. And though our processes and methods were very different, we also shared a commitment to considering how communities under stress, I think now we would say under siege, and under resource still make it a priority to improvise arrangements for its members' well-being, as well as to admire and enact reciprocity and redistribution. We saw a similarity in how value is produced in ways different than the market economy, with not all interactions motivated by the desire to make money, and not all forms of value defined by the demand for profit. So in both urban gyms in Lisbon and in New York, and social relations show can occur both within and in response to the market. So this is what E.P. Thompson called a moral economy in the making of the English working class, later in Customs in Common, and what Paul Gilroy has elaborated on in his book Darker Than Blue on the moral economies of Black Atlantic culture. What I mean by a moral economy of the gym is a collective, though not uncontested, sense of what the community feels is fair and just. A moral economy of the gym claims and actualizes a set of rights unavailable outside the gym, and sets and enforces social norms, obligations, behaviors. Like the participants of E.P. Thompson's 18th century bred crowd, men, and I'm going to stick for this for the purposes of the comparison to men, although I hope that changes over time, assert and defend certain customs. Through corresponding with James, I came to see both Jim's moral economies as an answer to post-industrial capitalism that is unique in its own right, an anti-capitalist indictment, as well as a system of morality. Thanks very much. Over to you.
That's up? The image? Nice. Wait.
It's not on the other one.
No, it's fine. So thank you so much, Lucia, for organising this. You really facilitated the whole thing, and to the Centre for Place, Culture and Politics. I've heard about this space, and it is an honour to be here. Okay. Hey.
Oh, wow, this one doesn't have a...
Okay, I'll use this one. Yeah, I mean, it was fortuitous that Lucia and I were able to meet and converse from this invitation through Ruthie that when you came to Lisbon, and as Lucia mentioned, we initially were kind of speaking about, I guess, issues and questions related to ethnographic practice, and even though I identify as a visual artist, I acknowledge that I tend to work with other people, often filming people who are not actors, not always, but often. And sort of as I'm working through this over the years, building a practice, I realise that a lot of the things I struggle with and the questions I have are very much related to ethnographic practice. And so I'm starting to, read into that and understand that more, but actually this correspondence we had was very valuable, to that understanding. And at the same time, I had an invitation to exhibit at this space called L'Université, which is on the outskirts of Lisbon. So this is an image of the gallery, and it's a really interesting gallery space, and the connection came because I was actually in Lisbon to participate in this independent study program, and through that the program also runs this gallery space, and so it's kind of led on to opportunity to exhibit. But the thing about the gallery space is it's almost totally, completely, absolutely detached from an art scene in Lisbon, where the gallery is near the airport. It's on the outskirts of Lisbon. It's about 25 minutes drive. And so it's not just the geographic distance, but the director of the gallery is absolutely aware that this space is out of context in relation to the surrounding suburbs. And the surrounding suburbs themselves are interesting. I think they're really interesting. They do have an interesting history where about a week ago I did a class with Lucia and I showed some Pedro Costa films. Does anyone know this Portuguese director Pedro Costa? I mean, I think that a lot of the architecture and the situation of this space is connected to what Pedro Costa's looked at with his films, where previously it was an area where there was a number of quintas, like small farms, and barracas, kind of like favelas in a way. This was levelled totally by the state, and through state and private funding, a bunch of really expensive people paying $1,000 for a golden visa where you get Portuguese citizenship. That's one thing. And then people who lived in the barracas, in the informal, precarious structures, were allocated social housing. So the gallery's in the middle of this place, and in a way, people in Portugal say it's a social experiment. For what I understand, this thing, it's quite unique in Lisbon for putting the expensive condominiums in very close proximity to the social housing. So the gallery's kind of slotted in to this place. And I couldn't imagine working, for me, in this environment without somehow responding to that context. But even though I'd been in Portugal for a year, I still felt, in a lot of ways an outsider, if not culturally and linguistically. So part of the process was to understand what happens in this area, what the relationships between social activities that happen in the area, structured through community organisations, if they have any relationship to the gallery, who are the people who live here. So through doing this thing that I later discovered was pretty much field notes, I was walking around, I was speaking to people, and I looked at a number of organisations, and I was drawn to the boxing gym, partly by chance, but partly because I had an interest in boxing, very passing. But it allowed me an in. And one of the things about the boxing gym was also I was drawn to the architecture of the gym. So this is just outside the boxing gym, and this development's been like this for about 10 years because it happened before the crisis, but then with the crisis, obviously, funds kind of stopped, and also there was issues with, there was architectural issues, but this kind of typifies this sense of limbo that in a way exists in this area. So the boxing gym, Cruz Vermelha, means Red Cross, has this incredible aqua colour, which is one thing that drew me to it, but also it was quite different and it was one of the things that exists in the area. I was also interested, I started to think about the boxing gym, specifically this boxing gym, as a type of heterotopia. And it wasn't, you know, I don't think I was seeking like an academic justification for my attachment, but I definitely felt an aesthetic, and it was purely aesthetic. There was a trophy room with this incredible aqua, you know, colour scheme. There was these traces of past identities and usages, including mirror balls and disco lights, because any community space has multiple functions, and they used to have parties here, but then there were shootings and stabbings, so they stopped having them so much. But there was also a stage, of course, where the ring was kind of embedded. And then the lighting system was this kind of combination of like celebratory festive lighting and then this more functional kind of lighting. And there was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There was a number of things happening which I found fascinating. So then it was a question of, you know, I think I kind of started to work out how to respond to the invitation to exhibit in this place. But then the question started to become things like, how to respond to the gallery space, which I thought was in a way out of context to the area in which it was located. How would I make work that definitely wasn't for the community? Because I think that could be seen as patronising, and it definitely wasn't something I was interested in, making it for people, but I was interested in engaging with a specific place in which I was kind of found myself as being and understanding the relations that were happening there, and also my relationship as an artist who tends to film people with what was happening inside the boxing gym. And then how do I enter into this context as an outsider? And how do I produce an aesthetic experience from this context, from a place that in many ways the place and the people have already been exploited. So, you know, this thing about a moral economy, maybe if I pay them money for being filmed, that answers questions, and I soon found out it isn't an answer necessarily. So what I'm going to do, show an excerpt from a video which kind of constituted the central piece of the exhibition that resulted from this process. And then afterwards I'll speak for about another 5 minutes or so to kind of give a sense of how this video fitted into the body of work. I also, I think it was important that I kind of reflected on the experience of boxing training, if anything because I started to want to visualise a performance of bodies becoming exhausted, and I didn't realise what that exhaustion meant until I trained. And so I think a lot of this thing, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but the relationship between me, the camera, and the person doing the shadow boxing, because I wasn't actually interested in the conflict of boxing, it was actually more this performance, which I saw was almost a choreography, and it was potential violence without actual conflict, and I liked this thing of the shadow boxing that the opponent is invisible, so either they use their own reflections as a reference, and the mirror also being a heterotopia, or you project the image of an invisible other, which is a shadow about a metre and a half in front of you. So all these things started to interest me a lot, and I learnt this through actually doing some training myself. So what I've got to do is press start at the same time. No, it's going to work. Is that TV up as well? Have we got, is it saying, what's it saying? It's got this little thing. If I cancel this, it's good? Okay. So with this video, there's a narration. It's 9 minutes.
Establishing shot, suburb, out. Camera on crane, 8 to 12 meters above ground. Camera pans across open area on the outskirts of the city, moving slowly and smoothly from left to right, reading landscape. The scene is surveyed carefully, but no detail is held in the frame for an extended period of time. Camera moves horizontally at a pace of approximately 10 seconds for 10 degrees. At approximately 180 degrees from its initial position, the camera's movement slows further to draw attention to a cluster of apartment buildings. Late afternoon, midsummer. Ambient light, high contrast with slight orange tone suggesting intense heat. Objects, structures, and people cast extended shadows when caught in direct sunlight. The area revealed in the opening scene appears to be undergoing development, with structures collapsing in the foreground and new structures being built in the background. The camera's horizontal movement exists in tension with the vertical movement of buildings, which either gradually consume or reconstitute themselves. People can be seen in the distance, although their identities are partially obscured by the shadows that they gravitate towards. Due to the direction of the afternoon sun, shadows also cover their faces, serving to maintain their anonymity. The foreground area is delineated by partially collapsed brick walls supporting a palimpsest of plaster, paint, and paper. Because of their severely dilapidated state, it is unclear whether these walls previously housed domestic, commercial, or light industrial spaces. Weeds and vines penetrate the walls, soft organic matter slowly but persistently violating the authority of man-made structures. Bricks, concrete, stone, plaster, and exposed steel reinforcement. Within this partially demolished area there is a topology of dirt, weeds, and debris, which provides cover for figures who either crouch, camouflaged by the mounds of dirt, or who move quickly through the area, always following the same path. A trail has been carved out by the repetition of bodies walking from here to there, or vice versa. The apartment blocks that came into focus towards the end of the establishing shot consist of newly built, weathered, and partially constructed buildings. Some of these apartment blocks are fully or nearly fully occupied. This is evident from the clothes, towels, and bedding hanging from windows, 5, 10, or 15 floors above ground, as well as the collection of plants, flags, and coloured material which pattern the otherwise anonymous facades. The buildings exist in close proximity to one another, but their varying facades, scales, and designs suggest there are significant differences between their real estate value. Some concrete is exposed and worn with stains left behind by overworked air conditioning units, while some concrete is impossibly smooth, its surface a perfect flat grey. Concrete, glass, soft material, organic matter, a single palm tree, reflections, grass, asphalt, and steel. In the distance, cranes are poised as if about to start work, waiting patiently to carefully position glass panels into voids of a large concrete structure that appears to be the framework for new apartment blocks. The rods of steel reinforcement growing from the last level of one of the structures indicate that there are more stories yet to be added. There are subtle and not so subtle details suggesting that the cranes are in permanent pause and extended breaks, which could continue for years. Details such as a blank billboard, only its steel surface creating a distorted mirror of the urban scene unfolding around it. The layout of new streets lined with saplings, 2 of which intersect at a roundabout and go no further, beyond them a large open grassland area. The lack of other construction infrastructure, such as trucks, scaffolding, construction equipment. A security fence beginning to collapse around the construction site. ripped security tape, which is the only thing that animates the building as it twists in the afternoon breeze, and a definite but non-specific sense of limbo, existing in the area and seemingly made up of scenes, interactions, structures, light, movement, and more, some that are already described above. There are numerous other empty structures. These structures are in themselves a sort of void, made up of smaller holes or voids not yet filled or complete. Over time, the voids will probably expand. Cracks will form. Perhaps the weeds and plants will emerge from these cracks and force the concrete to fracture, as they have done elsewhere. Pieces of solid material will fall, and there may be a tip in equilibrium, where there is eventually more void than solid form. This is a critical point where all that is solid may turn into dust. But for now, the structures refuse to fall. They continue to stand, not so much defiant as resigned to their situation. Buildings standing because they don't know what else to do. Notes on the first scene. In the dilapidated space of the establishing shot, there was once an outdoor cinema and restaurant. It was in this space during summer that popular films were projected onto a large screen which presumably stood close to where the cardboard shelters are now erected in the vacant block. None of this is evident in the establishing shot. The memory of the outdoor cinema only exists as a sort of footnote to the current scene, something described by a narrator. Cut to next scene. A street. External shot. Travelling shot past complete and incomplete buildings. Shot at eye level, camera moving slowly and smoothly, capturing details as a pedestrian would, rather than from above as before. Some of the structures which were surveyed at a distance in the opening shot now surround the camera. Occasionally, the camera tilts slightly upwards to view these structures from its new human point of view. Late summer afternoon light intensifies at street level. Soft apricot tone washes concrete structures and colours people's faces. Heat causes slight distortion of objects and figures in the far background. Figures appear in the shot. The shadows fall in a different direction to the opening shot, continually creeping away from the structures from which they are cast. The figures are no longer anonymous, as the afternoon light carves out features on their faces. They ignore the camera, although their body language is guarded, introverted and self-conscious, giving the impression that they are fully aware of, and not totally comfortable with, the camera's presence. It is unclear whether the figures are performing as extras, or whether they are actually real residents, caught by the camera in a moment of day-to-day activity. As the camera moves further into the street, it shows a group of figures sitting in formation within an open space at the end of the street. This space is not exactly a courtyard, as it is not fully enclosed. Rather, it's a sort of public gathering area between two pedestrian thoroughfares. The thoroughfares intersect between three buildings. Each building serves a different social function and are built at a much smaller scale than the surrounding apartment blocks. 5 men and 2 women sit on benches and on top of a low wall. They delineate a space between them of approximately 5 by 7 meters. Collectively, they carefully monitor this 35 square meter space. The men sit with their backs to a bright blue building, staring straight ahead at the low, newly built concrete structure in front of them. And the women sit perpendicular on top of a bench with their feet on the seat below. They are not here to talk, as they rarely exchange words. Instead, they communicate through glances and subtle body language, such as a slight nod or a twitch of the hand. Their bodies form a human perimeter, with the dual function of surveying all movement and interactions within the space, as well as creating a physical and possibly psychological border around it. The camera slowly invades this border, and there is a simultaneous shift in body language by all the figures, expressed in subtly different ways. As with the previous scene, the camera does not linger on particular objects, figures, or details. Instead, it keeps moving at a steady and objective pace.
So what was happening in that? Sorry. As I said, it's an excerpt from a longer video that was the centerpiece to this exhibition. So the video is really simple, and it's, you know, it was a sort of a new thing for me in a way, because the structure of training negated my need to edit. So it's purely based on the 3-minute round, 1-minute break, 3-minute round structure. And they do 9 rounds, so we just saw 2 rounds. So basically these 2 people that are projected on either side of a suspended screen, they're never actually in conflict with each other, and for almost 40 minutes they continually do this training, and they become more and more tired. And then what I sort of started to think of myself, or at least my way of working, as a human camera. So, you know, I wasn't visible, but I was very much present. And what was happening is that I wrote this kind of descriptive prologue, which in a way forms a context to the video, because the video, you know, is this very simple repetitive performance where in a way nothing happens, but a lot happens. They become very tired, they sweat a lot, their technique, you know, sort of falters in some ways. But also I have this technique that I've got the camera and I'm trying to dance with them, negotiate with them, and do this continually for the 9 rounds. So I also have to maintain some sort of stability. So there's this fragility in our relationship, which I found really interesting. And then it's also this thing that the very simple technique of shadowboxing, which actually I find really difficult, because you're projecting this invisible opponent, or you're negotiating your image in the mirror, which is an impossible over there, inverted, is something that for them, the mirror was a reference. For me, I had to do everything I could to avoid the camera being in the mirror. So I constantly remained invisible even though I was present. So these were just things I was sort of playing with that allowed me to make this video without even having to, in a way, develop my own structure. The structure was already pre-given. And the narration, which I actually just included as a text, and there's some here if anyone wants to take one, in the exhibition, there's a movement where it describes a camera. So it's a prologue without any dialogue. And I guess this was partly this thing of that I could understand some Portuguese and I could speak some Portuguese at the time, but not good enough to really, the relationship was very gestural. So the prologue was this thing about observing a city, buildings, transformations happening architecturally, figures in the space, and there was a lot of drug dealing happening, but it was in some ways overt, but it was there was a code, which I found fascinating. And so the prologue was about describing a movement of a camera which started from a macro perspective of the suburb, and actually, in a way, moved in an impossible way, which was kind of down the street, which is not impossible, but the description entered into the boxer's body and then projected through their body onto the mirror and then flipped around and looked at them from the mirror. Before observing the room and then finishing. So there was a kind of a movement from outside into the gym, into the body and out of the body again. And so there was an overlap between what was happening visually with the video of the training and what was happening with the text. I'll just to give a little bit of an idea. So the other question was, how does a viewer relate to all this? Because, you know, they don't necessarily care about boxing. They haven't spent 4 months in a gym on the outskirts of Lisbon. In a way, the work wasn't about boxing. I looked at boxing as a site, as a performance, and as a site in which a work could be actualised. And of course, I found it fascinating, but I didn't want to make a work about boxing. But I thought there was a possibility of somehow including the viewer within this kind of frame of reflections, of movement, of confrontation, of layering of urban landscape with an interior space of the gym. So within the gallery, as I said, there was this suspended frame, a screen, where on each side one of the boxers was performing their 9 rounds. But I applied a mirrored surface to the windows of the gallery, and it had multiple functions. It was to block out light, but it was also to create a mirrored surface. So through the reflection in the window, you could see the other opponent, which you'd have to negotiate around the screen to get a sense of the relationship between these two figures. But you could also see yourself looking, because obviously it reflected inside the gallery, and you could see, importantly, it was a two-way mirror, so you could still see outside. So there was this relationship to everything that happens outside, which I felt was very detached from what happens within the gallery space. And so I think I might stop there. I think, you know, Genev's going to talk about some things that overlap with this. But also just to say, I guess what I saw what I was doing was trying to develop a narrative about my experiences in this space and the relationship to the space within a broader context of Portugal without it being somehow didactic. And what I was interested in doing is to do that in a fragile way and to kind of think about a fluid narrative. So, as I said, the video had a structure, but it didn't have a narrative beyond the kind of the bodies that move, that were constantly in movement, and the camera negotiating that movement. But then there was these elements that kind of were somehow constituted a larger story. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to just
Tell me when
play
we want
that
to.
like kind of partway through.
Okay, you just tell me,
Just
and
tell you?
I'll get it going.
And then this, should I use that mic? Because this one doesn't work, does it? Okay. Okay. So my project is on contemporary art about boxing, specifically the figure of the female boxer and the ways in which art making can both support and challenge the static fixing of identity and meaning that can occur in mainstream social understanding of the boxing body. I'm primarily interested in the paradoxes present in the plurality of the subject, something that Lucia referred to at the end of her talk. On one hand, a political need exists to represent the particular body of the female boxer, and to count it as a body that matters. On the other hand, the female boxing body is an example of physicality that is not totally captured by semantic cultural definition. My overall intention is to articulate an understanding of the subject that allows for its irresolution as a lived body. I'm not going to focus on the female boxer so much because possibly it's too specific of a subject for this talk, and also because for me, the female boxer is primarily a way into perhaps a more universal investigation of what it means to have a body that moves and how this movement can be accounted for without ignoring or denying the political issues that surround bodies, and in this context, boxing and people who box. That said, my inquiry into the figure of the female boxer leads me to an essential possibility. If the boxing body is not about men, there's a level of this body that is not about gender at all, then there's a significant area of the boxing body that has not been examined in sociology or really anywhere that I've found. I'm interested in the possibility that this area is the physical, corporeal experience of the body, and that there are aspects of this experience that cannot be accounted for with fixed definitions. As Joyce Carol Oates wrote, because a boxing match is a story without words, this that it has no text, that it is some primitive, inarticulate, only that the text is improvised in action, the language, a dialogue between the boxers of the most refined sort. One might say as much neurological as psychological, a dialogue of split-second reflexes. In many instances, contemporary art about boxing mirrors sociological discourse in that the boxer is presented as a resolved subject, one that contains a series of set meanings. For example, the boxer is a modern-day gladiator who represents capitalist exploitation of the human body. Within this understanding, there are some very complex racial issues around black masculinity and systematized violence. Issues that I am also not focusing on in this context, but nonetheless are very present in this topic. Another example of resolved or fixed meaning that is applied to the boxer in boxing is the idea that boxing is a metaphor for internal turmoil or aggression. There are many examples of this understanding in film and contemporary art. The understanding being that boxers must be angry or working through difficult, usually poverty-related life circumstances that require them to channel their aggression. This particular definition of the boxer is especially powerful in terms of the female boxer. In sociological discourse and mainstream presentation, female boxers are commonly seen as enacting gender transgression through the violent sport of boxing. While I do not totally discount these versions of boxing and boxers, in fact, they're crucially important in terms of recognizing political dynamics and the ways in which cultural inequality can lead to dehumanization and exploitation. I also know that there are more levels of meaning to be found in the identity of the boxer. And more importantly, that these meanings and understandings cannot be fixed. They are in flux. Basically, the boxing body, and in turn, most human bodies, are always in motion, and therefore cannot be understood via conclusive or complete identities. The moving boxing body is of central importance to me because actual physical movements of a boxer are both symbolic as representations of archetypal issues, such as conflict, and in their rhythmic repetitions and variations, highlight the potential movement always present in a living human body. The characteristic of potential that exists in a body, the possibility of infinite trajectories of movement, crosses over into theoretical discourse on the body because its undeniable movement questions the relevancy of a stable definition of the body. The discursive body, meaning one that has been culturally identified, is totally defined by its positioning on a grid of culturally constructed significations. Male versus female, black versus white, gay versus straight, and so on. While these definitions have significance, there's something missing. When I think of my body and ask what it does to earn that name, two things stand out. It moves, it feels. In fact, it does both at the same time. It moves as it feels, and it feels itself one that moves. Moving body is never in position. It is only ever present in transition. Perhaps a body is only still when it has been named or described. Yet even this seemingly resolving act of defining is always changing according to who or what is interpreting it. Paradoxically, the quality of the actual living body as ever-changing belongs to the same reality as the version of the body as a positioned thing, i.e. female, white, educated, 147 pounds. In boxing, your weight down to the ounce can actually position you more than any other quality, etc. We each have only one body, so these different interpretations have to occupy the same space. And it is here for me that art becomes a very important part of our knowledge of the boxing body. I'm going to show some images of contemporary art about boxing. It's in no way comprehensive, but it's an example. Yeah. Okay, so is it playing? This is Satch Hoyt's sculpture. It's called Don King Dom. This is a piece called yeah, let's pause it. Just back up a little. Okay, I want to give credit, rather. Okay, so this is a piece called To Be 20 in Iran by Nuska Tavakolian. Okay, so we can play again. Yeah, I think now maybe I'm caught up. This is called Workout, Libby Black, by Libby Black. This is called Muhammad Ali. It's gigantic, and it's actually made up of punching bags. This one is called all you heard was Papa, don't hit me no more. This is my work. It's untitled, Feathered Boxing Gloves. You can just play now, I think. Feathers, yeah. Yeah, just go. It's, my work's obviously also quite figurative and representational, so I'm not holding it up as an example of an answer, really. It's just part of a continuum. Yeah, that's my work too. And this is Paul Pfeiffer's still of his video called The Long Count, where he actually erased the bodies of Muhammad Ali and some of his kind of major opponents. And then this is James's work, some of it that was part of the installation of A Sort of Shadow. As you can see, it's a series of kind of text-based maps, visual data. Okay, thank you. So I feel that those drawings, I don't know, if maybe can we like pause on one of them maybe? Yeah, thank you. And present, I feel that these drawings present a version of the boxing body that is most definitely unresolved. There are, wait a minute, sorry, gotta back up. Much of the contemporary art that I just showed about boxing supports an understanding of the boxing body as a symbol or a metaphor for broad political issues such as gender enactment, gender transgression, capitalist exploitation, anger, personal turmoil, etc. These are valid elements of boxing and cannot be ignored. Also, some really good, important art has been made about these subjects. However, I'm primarily interested in the unresolved body, the undefinable experience of having a moving body, an experience that cannot be utilized as shorthand for these issues. So then I feel that James's work, these drawings, move beyond that. Although the work is about a corporeal experience and thinking about a corporeal experience, there is no body present. And in this way, the conclusive form of the boxing body is expanded. The text excerpts in these drawings are taken out of context, which creates a certain ambiguity. In the case of the boxing manual excerpts, which is where some of the text came from, these 18th century manuals, something that is apparently objective and vocational becomes highlighted as a sort of social commentary or even as poetic. Phrases such as, when you don't have a friend, use a shadow. From my perspective, the work is not a pointed search for what the boxing body means, but rather a mind map that reveals the artist's process of making connections. The introspective quality of this work, which emphasizes the experience of the artist rather than only representing the boxer as a distinct, separate subject, questions the othering system that typically defines boxers and art about boxing. Although the drawings do not explicitly challenge this othering paradigm, I posit that by expanding the representation of the boxing body, they do point to a layer of experience that questions the resolution of the subject as other and fixed. The drawings are about boxing and about having a body, yet the boxing body is disassembled and presented as a series of written thoughts connected by drawn lines. There is no categorical body in them. James has fragmented the boxing body and also placed it in the very intimate realm of individual thought and personal associations. I'm going to end with a Kristeva quote, just why not? She always is relevant, maybe. Might not the singular initiative be, in the end, that intimate, infinitesimal, but ultimate force on which the deconstruction of any condition depends? Thank you.
Great. Well, hopefully questions or comments that folks have. So please feel free. We're going to open it up to the audience now. We have a good period of time to discuss. I think that CUNY would like us to come down and use the mic because we are live streaming, as I mentioned. Nobody's going to enforce that rule, so if you don't do it, nobody's going to get mad. You can stay in your seat, but if you feel like you want, I don't know, your 5 seconds of fame, feel free to come down and use the microphone. Yeah, we could repeat it. Okay. Or we could do like a human microphone. Just like nothing, no thoughts. Brotherton.
So, I thought it was really provocative, but I'm not sure I understood all of it, obviously, but because some of the discourse is sort of different to what I'm used to. But with James, I was thinking about that, there were a number of sort of theoretical concepts that you used, but you never actually spelled out any theory, and I was just wondering, what theory informs a lot of the kind of visual ethnography that you do. Just another little side question on that. I was just thinking about, you coming into Lisbon, not, I don't know how much of the language you knew, you took some of it, but not, and then obviously got better at it and so on and so forth. And then, you've got that, extraordinary eye and able to indeed construct the kind of built around it, right? So, but was there also, obviously, as you've got, going to work with the community, to what degree did the community help you to visualise what you ended up with, as your project? And just one third question, if I may. And so that's what was your first name?
Genève.
That last question, that last phrase, that you I didn't catch it, but it sounded really important. Could you repeat it? That last.
Kristeva, the Kristeva quote, yes. I should know it by heart, but I don't. Might not the singular initiative be, in the end, that intimate, infinitesimal, but ultimate force on which the deconstruction of any condition depends? I'm actually not interested in resolving it, but I think that art can illuminate a kind of knowledge about it, perhaps because there's more room for things not to be concluded with art as opposed to, say, the written word, or, academic written word anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, the thing about the theory is funny because I think, maybe it sounds like a cop-out, but within this project or within other projects, I feel like I'd like to read more. I read, it's an important part of the process, but at some point it's metabolized, and I couldn't list import, I'm not going to reference what was important to me because it really became mixed, and it was it was fiction. I was reading Camus, The Fall, and for some reason that was important, and then I got obsessed with melancholy and mourning for some reason, and then there was this stuff about heterotopias, but I would never participate in some Foucault panel and pretend that's my thing, because it's not. And I think the boxing, it was just about finding a way of having a personal relationship with this stuff, and some of it made sense, some of it didn't, and I think that's, you know, that's in some ways what you're saying about these mind map things. And for me, they're not a substantial work, but I guess it was something like, it was strategic in the sense that as soon as you frame something and put it in an exhibition, of course, like you see it as a work, but it was actually a genuine part of my process of just collecting these different references. And some of them were funny, you know, these 18th century boxing manuals, I don't think they were theoretical references, but I was laughing reading them, and they, you know, they just trigger things. So it really was a sort of, I'm trying to think of, there weren't linear associations, but yeah, I mean, I think then the question about the gym's interesting, and you were saying, like, did they help me, like in terms of aesthetically, my decisions to visualise the work, to construct the work? No, not at all. But of course, they helped me a lot. So they were incredible, and I mean, I think we were talking a little bit about, I was having some problems at one stage. Like, I had funding from Australia, which in some ways helped this project. I'm like, well, I've got money, and I know for a fact the money I got for this project is relatively, it's a huge amount to what a lot of the people are making per hour in this gym who are helping me do this. So what do? Do I pay them? And then some of the guys like, we don't want your money, we're not interested in your money. And then I was, you know, writing to Lucia, like, what does this mean? You know, and then this moral economy thing came up. And the trainer, for example, he was opening the gym early so I could get in there and film. It was this quite intimate thing. It was just me in the box, so we closed off the gym. And, but we had to get access, so the trainer was coming in early every time I wanted to film. But then that started to become problematic because the Portuguese state, he works for the state, he works for a hospital, makes every public servant work another hour a day, you know, which constitutes almost a whole other day a week. And I wanted to be in there before the sun went down too much. He's like, and he's trying to explain to me in this quite long thing in Portuguese. I thought he was like having a problem with his wife, but he was saying, me and my wife both work. You know, we have to work now another hour, but we can't come early anymore. And my biggest concern was, oh, the light, oh, it's not my biggest concern. But to be honest, in my head, I was thinking, oh, shit, the light's going to be different. So my concerns, you know, a lot of times were very, you know, specifically aesthetic, but I had huge help from them. But actually, you know, a lot of ways he was disappointed. He was like, why would you be interested in shadowboxing? You know, like, don't you want to get up on this, you know, in the ring and film, and, you know, maybe you could come to a fight. And at one stage I was like, maybe I'll put a GoPro camera on my head and I'll have this kind of point of view thing. But we had a bit of a clash in terms of aesthetics. And I mean, I think they came to the exhibition and they were supportive. I don't know how interested they were, but then one of the ways I found to help pay back was to make some promotional videos for their Facebook page with hip hop soundtrack and heaps more action and hitting bags, and I think that was, in terms of a representation of some sort of image value, much more than what I made for the gallery. But I think that's fine.
I think it's a really good question, though, Dave, what you raised, because I think in a lot of ways, our work, so Dave is an ethnographer, and our work is about making bodies visible, right? So when we hear that bodies might be being manipulated or changed or evaporating or being cast in a different way, our project is very much about, I always use the Paul Willis definition of ethnography, which is that it's our understandings of our participants' understandings. And crucial to that, if you are interested in anti-racist, anti-capitalist work, is about rendering bodies visible. And I think one of the things that I've learned a tremendous amount from both James and Genevieve is the ways that people can tolerate and work through spaces of ambiguity, which I am not good at. And also, to be honest, that in sociology, it's a profession that doesn't necessarily reward that book, and you have to, and what is this, what's the big picture, what's the big so what? And so it's why we were somewhat motivated to put on this panel is, what are the different ways that people approach almost everything but the spectacle of fight night, which is what everybody focuses on. So we are interested in very different ways of thinking about training, about being in a body, about owning a body. For me, you know, we sort of move more macro, like as we move down the panel. So for me, post-industrialism, what people are doing in the gym tell us about larger social structural circumstance. So I think that that's where some of the tension on this panel comes from, is is that ambiguity? At what point do I feel uncomfortable and have to push back and say, no, but it is a body and there is exploitation, and that's what I want to pursue. But at the same time, what we've managed to do is, I think, or at least I've managed to see working with Genevieve and with James, is a whole other perspective on the sport that I never would be able to find myself. And that by working across disciplines and in different areas, for me, art was terrifying, because I just tend to feel dumb around artists, but because I'm so literal. But in many ways, it opened how I was able to see my field site in a different way through the ambiguities and the tensions and the inconclusivity, if that's a word, of their work.
Could you maybe just tease that out a bit more in terms of what I find really interesting about the panel coming together, both James and Lucia mentioned this to me when we first met last week, is that cross-disciplinary potential for new forms of language to emerge, new forms of research methodologies and ways of understanding something. But it's not just, even just the way you say the word field note as an artist, and James borrowed that term earlier on in the conversation, but some of the term that artists potentially use to undertake the research of, or even want to talk about social practice, we don't often have social art practice. We don't often have the language to talk about what we're trying to articulate. And it seems like those kind of things also came about. We just tease that out a bit more in terms of what came out of it.
I mean, maybe in some ways, I mean, I think it's an ongoing process. Maybe also that's maybe what Dave was hinting at, like there's things in here which are connected but unresolved references or, you know, theories, which I think is something I'm interested in continuing. But I think, I don't know whether it was terminology, like it was definitely process.
And it was remarkably, we came to find that it was a remarkably similar process that we underwent.
And so it was kind of funny, like in a way, you know, we all in our fields sometimes get stuck, and then having this conversation about field notes, and I was like, that's what you call it. Like, in a way, when it's another field, you know, you say you feel dumb about that, it's like, of course it goes both ways, and it's like, so what are those, like, academic, social science, ethnographer, you know, whatever, what are they doing? What are those field notes? And you realize, like, maybe I'm kind of doing, you know, in a way, like, you know, like dumbing it down a little bit. So I think it allows you, like, a different perspective into your field and some of the things that you're doing to understand how they function in another field, or to start to understand that. And it wasn't just field notes, there are other examples, but I can't think of them right now.
I think the mind maps were, so the mind maps came from research. Mind maps came from, or some of the mind maps came from research that I had done for my dissertation and had done nothing with. So I'd done this archival research into training manuals from the 18th and 19th century and sent them to James on a whim that was just like, check these out. I haven't done anything with them. I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but just see what you think. And then you were like, oh, like these are a text, a thing, right? It becomes an object once it's sent. And then had a completely different direction that he took what I consider data from the archival research into a mind map. I mean,
I'm really interested by why you ended your conversation on the way to construction. What's at stake for you?
I think I ended it with that, or I felt compelled to include that quote because I find myself returning to it. Kind of the ways in which something can be so singular and specific, yet also like intimate, infinitesimal, but also somehow universal or expansive. So how to deconstruct the condition of that we're placed in, or, you know, for example, that my subject is placed in, which in some ways is me, too. And how does it start with my own experience and my own very specific expression, but that in some ways it's sort of circular and it does remain a question. So that's part of it too, because I'm interested in how the subject or the boxer is not used as shorthand for, you know, an array of you know, issues or understandings. So then what does that mean? What's the opposite of shorthand? I mean, it's something that's very subjective and, you know, specific. So how to kind of balance that? I mean, it does, as I said, it remains a question for me. And the deconstruction part of it is very important. I don't know if that answers. It's.
I'd love to hear a couple more sentences, if you're
Okay, I'd be happy to. She wrote this in regard to what female genius is. It was part of her female genius books, and I'm using it as a way in to understanding if a condition can be, in fact, deconstructed, or if a body can move out of the definitional framework that kind of prescripts its every move. And can it happen? I mean, I think that it can. I think that it does happen. And I think that it can be, I'm suspecting, or I suggest that it's kind of rooted in the kind of individual yet also very universal experience of moving, of movement, of potential, of that trajectory, because the kind of the definition of movement is that it is unresolved. It's not, it hasn't, you know, like an arrow in flight is not in flight once it lands. And so, and in flight, there's kind of infinite potential. So that's part of it. It's a few more sentences. Yeah, you're welcome.
So I saw a hand over here and then a hand in the back.
Thank you for presenting. If the boxing body trains to both evade and receive blow, red as trauma, force, pain, what have you three been able to learn or discern from the gym and the boxing body as to how as to how pain and trauma and force have been received in a so-called post-industrial economy?
I mean, I can start off by saying that there's so much written about violence in boxing, when I first started doing this project, I would get attacked by people who would say, you know, boxing is so violent, how can you write about such a violent sport, such a violent pastime? And I would say, well, we live in a violent culture. Just look at our city streets up to our foreign policy. And it was really then that I made the decision not to pursue that line of inquiry, because if you spend time in boxing gyms, which you may have, you realize that part of the experience is actually a very small part. So training, being in the ring, sparring, is, I don't know, Jenna would know better than I do, but I figured it out around 5% of the time. And so what I was really interested in is if that sparring is 5% or 10%, what's that other 90% about? And what I turned to was ethics of care, intimate relationships, and ways that communities came together not so much about the inflicting of violence on others or pain on others, but ways in which people were using the gym to respond to social, stay away from that social injury, to talk about racism and sexism and class subjugation. But in terms of bodily pain and bodily violence, I made a decision pretty early not to go down that route. There's huge debates. You know, the American Medical Association has gotten involved and said that we need to ban boxing because of this. And I imagine that in the current climate of sports studies, we're going to be hearing a little bit more about concussions. But my work was really, what have we not seen in the boxing gym that might surprise us, which are more about relationships and social practices that give people a sense of dignity. But that might be different for everybody else.
No, I didn't confront violence at all. It wasn't part of, for me, it wasn't part of my project. There was no, I think, I saw one spar between the train, there was no sparring. And when I was filming, it was, like, for me, it was more a process of exhaustion and physical change, sweat. It was the space of the room that was liquid. You know, I was interested in this kind of fluid movement of the camera and a kind of fluidity of the image where there was a very short focus. Like, I'm talking once again on very aesthetic terms, and that the gym in summer in Lisbon was 40 degrees and the sweat was palpable. And so that kind of stuff is what I found informed the work. It was bodily in some ways, but there was no violence at all. Sorry? 104. Oh, yeah.
Our temperature converter in the
Super.
second row.
How did you know that? Did you really know that? 100? Yeah. I think it's a really good question, but yeah, for me it wasn't relevant.
But my experience of it, there is violence. I mean, you do get hit, and you avoid being hit, and it's very real. I mean, there's kind of nothing more real. But as Lucia said, the truth is that the kind of experience of being a boxer in boxing, it's not a very big percentage of your experience, although you're training for it, and you're training with others who are also training for it. And that kind of community and that sort of, it's almost a leveling out of experience, because everyone experiences it the same way. I mean, it feels the same. I mean, this is a very kind of simple answer in a way, but it does feel the same, kind of, no matter what the structure, no matter kind of who you are in terms of your social identity. And I think that is a very essential part of the community. And yeah, so that's part of my answer to that in terms of the trauma and the violence and the pain, that it actually kind of paradoxically ends up being this, unifying or connective experience in the context of the boxing gym and training.
My comment is actually more directed towards Jeanette, because I know, and I've seen you box, and for me as a spectator, and for everybody that's experienced boxing, as a spectator, I feel that whatever happens to you or whatever happens to other boxers, it ripples through that audience, and everybody is equal at that moment. And I want to know if you can speak a little bit to, given that art is experienced by people and boxing, insofar as everyone is equal, and they feel those hits, everybody's there together. It's that we're all in, so to speak. So can you sort of speak a little bit to what the experience is for you as a boxer within the arena, within doing your Golden Gloves fights? How important is the audience? How much do you feel then? Is there an invisible connection that you can speak to?
The audience Okay, I think that kind of no matter, even though everyone's kind of in that space, there is this, you know, it's a tiny line, but it's kind of vast, what's in the ring and what's outside of the ring. And I mean, there's kind of a profound layers to that, but in terms of like the physical experience or the in the moment experience, it's more energetic than like feeling the energy, less feeling that anyone's in there with me, because I think that's a kind of a key element to boxing, is that no one's in there with you except the opponent and the referee. You know, Paul Pfeiffer, I showed a little piece of his work, a still of his video work called The Long Count, and he took Muhammad Ali's like major fights against Foreman and Liston and Frazier, and he meticulously, you may have seen it, I don't know if you have, it's, you know, you can, I don't know if you can see it online, but it's quite wonderful. He meticulously erased the bodies so that they kind of look like this shimmer, like wind over water. You can still kind of see them because it's not a perfect erasure. You can see he replaced it with pieces from the audience, frame by frame. And so they're these kind of like shimmering ghost-like things in the ring. And what you really find yourself watching, and when you see that, is the audience reacting, and like that, those waves that you're of, and then it becomes kind of like, what are you really watching when you're watching, you know, yourself or the spectator? And that leads to all kinds of questions, like about spectacle and, you know, and violence. And then, you know, Muhammad Ali in the ring is very different than me in the ring. I mean, you know, for some of the reasons that, you know, we're all talking about. You know, he's a black man in the 60s, and I'm not at all. I'm based, you know, I'm essentially, in some ways, an opposite social figure. But then at the same time, you know, there's things that are completely the same. Again, sort of a, maybe not a total answer, but.
No, I was actually thinking, you know, your visual of the arrows, not like no longer ones that hits, and that impacted me because I know seeing you not, and I don't watch many fights, I watch many because of you.
This is my sister. Everyone's got a sister. Yeah.
You're deconstructing it, and there's always going to be an element of it that's shared, I think, by everybody that's in a room with any boxer.
Yeah. And there's something that's kind of irreducible. And maybe that kind of gets back to what you were saying, Ruthie. I was attempting to really answer it, which is that kind of initiative, that movement and reality of being human, which means that there's endless potential in your movement until it's resolved, you know, by either definition or a label or, you know, even something as like landing a punch. But in that has the power, perhaps, to deconstruct the condition that, you know, that's providing structure. That might be kind of a utopian, but I'm, you know, that's what, how can we do it? You know, so.
So I want to recognize there's one hand, but can I just push a little bit more on that? Because you said, and if you don't want to, you
Okay.
but you talked about body in motion. You had two things, feeling and moving. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on the feeling part of that. We've been talking about an era, so the motion, body in movement, but then feeling body too. Or even what your thought process around that has been.
Well, it kind of came about when I was thinking how art can make us feel things. It really was kind of my relationship to art that brought about that particular, those words or that thought. Art that, and it's not just art, but kind of what makes us feel something physically through just looking at it, or, you know, not being touched, or, but it kind of a, it's not quite remote, but a sympathetic reaction. I think that, I know it's been called the haptic by, you may know the film theorist Vivian Sobchak writes about it, the haptic, which is that kind of, you know, you have a sympathetic reaction. Mm-hmm. You know, your heart rate actually goes up even though you're not experiencing it. So that's kind of what I was talking about but then obviously there's like the much more direct experience of feeling as you move, you know, that, and that, yeah, I mean, I think that part of it too was prioritizing that over thinking or defining the movement, is that you feel it first. Yeah, and that informs the thinking rather than the other way around, which I think can often be, discourse can get lost in that, I think. So, mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe you've, yeah.
It's a good question for the mirror, though, in terms of shadow boxing, in terms of a celebration of the self, is what does it mean to be looking at yourself, and what's the celebration, or maybe even pleasure in that? Yeah.
I don't know, I mean, yeah, it's a nice question. I think, like, it was more out of the nature of the gym space that those things happened to be there, but they somehow contributed, like the mirror ball and the disco lights, and it was a space that people would dance and celebrate, and now people were training and using their bodies to train. And I guess I romanticized that in a way, and I was thinking at one stage, like, how could I light this situation and film it, you know, like it's this solo performance, you know, the training. I didn't know I was working with maybe shadowboxing then, but I was thinking about it very visually, like maybe not as a celebration, but as a performance. Then the mirror becomes this kind of like reflection of yourself, checking yourself while you're performing. But then again, like in terms of like thinking about your own body, I think the mirror is like very, I found anyway, if I like thought about myself in the mirror, it totally throws you off. So it's just like a little visual clue. I don't think it's an existential like projecting into yourself. I think that's more interesting in terms of the camera using the mirror, you know. But in terms of actually for the boxer, I think the mirror is very much just a pragmatic thing. Yeah, and I mean, I think like it's a little bit romantic again, but I think, as I said, it was very intimate. This thing with the shadow boxing being this space, which other purposes might have been celebratory, but the lights don't work anymore, and the parties don't happen because they had these problems, so it's become kind of redundant. And so, you know, there's a kind of melancholy in that, and there's a melancholy that the person's in there by themselves, but you hear some of the sounds coming from outside, and then you have this voice, which is, I don't think melancholy, but it's somehow detached. So I don't think the celebration isn't like, it's not celebrated, but maybe it's potential, you know? Like it's been, or maybe it'll come. I don't know, but I just, yeah.
you talking to me or Jeanette? Oh, you're talking to me. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, sorry.
Talking to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should you start over on the question?
No, I know, I
got
was
it.
listening, yeah.
I mean, I could, yeah, okay.
I use that as an example of a kind of stream or common understanding of boxing now as kind of modern day gladiators. I mean, I've heard it often. It's even used sometimes in like the promotional posters, you know, it's kind of that way. And then kind of on a more like culturally critical level, it's, you know, the gladiators are thrown in as a blood sport. And gladiators were, you know, the slaves. Or, you know, the modern version would be, you know, working class, uneducated, you know, that they resort to that. And that, you know, it's the bloodlust of the crowd kind of thing, and that's what it's for. It's their bodies are being used, you know, for entertainment, and that is kind of what I was referring to when I said it. That it's that is a kind of a common understanding of it. And while on one level I think that it's true. I mean, that does happen. I was saying that there are other things going on also, and there are other versions of the boxing body that are not contained in that understanding. And I think too that another thing I was saying is that often contemporary art about boxing, as I've used this term before, but it works, is you know, they'll use the boxing body, and it's kind of instant shorthand to that kind of association, you know, blood sport, sacrifice. You know, that kind of thing, like people in bow ties watching other people bleed. So that is how I was using it.
And that has a particular history within women's boxing too, right? As
Yeah.
one of the Christy Martin, who's like one of the first professional athletes to make it to undercards of big fights. She was known as the bleeder, and people watched her because she bled so much. Like that was sort of her.
Yeah.
A lot of why people would even promote her. So I think just to affirm your decision and moving away from that, I would just say, great. Okay, I saw David, and then in the back, and then Bob.
Thank you for such an interesting panel. My question's for Lucia. So I was interested if you tease out a little bit more how I understood you have, in terms of the amateur boxers, you have them doing work that's without wages in the gym, and then they have wage work that elicits little social value or things that they find affirmative in that sense. And I wonder if you expand on that a little bit more, and then also to just talk about how you saw Gleason's as an institution of meaning making and the ethics of care.
Sure. So the work without wages was this sort of idea that I found when I had been doing research for a couple of years and realized that people were spending a phenomenal amount of their time in the gym working on their bodies. And when I would talk to them about their work, they talked about themselves as boxers, that they wanted to be known as boxers. And then when they would talk about their jobs, they would then refer to their occupational statuses as an athlete. And I found that really fascinating and meaningful because at that time, in 2003, there was a report that came out that I believe it was 51% of black men in the city did not have jobs, and about 67% of black men between the ages of 18 and 24 didn't have access to work. So there was very, very little work for black men at that time. I can't imagine those statistics are that different now. And so what people were doing was finding ways to receive recognition and dignity and identities based upon these 8-hour days at the gym. Now, you're not working on your body for 8 hours. in the gym, but you're socializing and you're reading and you're napping and you're playing dominoes, as Jenna might remember. It's a big part of gym culture. And so I was just interested in why would somebody do that? Like, what are the circumstances under which somebody would put so much effort? I mean, this is, I trained a little bit. It's almost a joke to say that on a panel with Genev, but trained a little bit. It is the hardest thing that I had ever done, and I was a Division I athlete. And so it's a phenomenal amount of work. And people really were proud of it. And I felt like in the sense of, in the environment, a post-industrial environment, that deserved to be heard. And that we needed to think about then how do we understand value? Because in sociology, a lot of these concepts were developed a long time ago. And how do we update and understand concepts like value, like capital, like work, like labor, in a post-industrial moment? People who were working jobs, there were very few of them, so I shouldn't give the sense that people were working 8 hours on their body in the gym and saying, I'm a boxer, but then going to other jobs. For the most part, people had a very, very difficult job, the time finding jobs outside the gym. But even in those cases, what was interesting is I would ask them what they do for a living, and they would say, I box. So the living, what I say, right, refers to is something really different than we would imagine if you ask somebody 50 years ago, what do you do for a living? Well, I do this. And maybe a person doesn't feel totally defined by that, but they would say for a living, right? I do this to pay the bills, but I also do this on the side. I play music, I do whatever. But this is the primary. This is an occupation. Meaning making. Yeah, so I have an interest in how people social worlds, and then how people act on those understandings. And in the gym, because I started this project in 2001 and was sort of going back and forth in what I ultimately thought about the meaning making in the gym. Was it reactionary? Was it leading to people just atomized individualism in which there's no social movements because everybody's working on their bodies and there's not, collective action? Is it providing some type of critique of larger structures? And so for me, meaning making was a way out of that dichotomy of, this is the Marxist escape valve, or blowing off steam in the gym so that we can keep the ideologies of the ruling class. Instead, it was just a sort of different way of entering into how people are processing their social worlds. And in that, like in every other space, there's liberatory, emancipatory, progressive, as well as reactionary possibilities. So, I saw some wonderful radical possibilities, but then there are also, less progressive ideas as well. But meaning making is sort of a way that I got out of really spending 4 years of saying it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad, and thinking, okay, I need some synthesis here if this is a dialectic or a different way of framing it, because I'm just not getting anywhere. I hope that answered. In the back, and then to Bob. Okay.
Yeah. You touch about the actual, aggression and violence of the thing. A lot of things that we're hearing, with sports, boxing, MMA, people, this is their own venue to actually be aggressive in a legal way. And I wanted to know how much you feel that
I think, you know, a lot of the time talking about boxing in any circumstance, it does seem to come down to this. You know, well, what about the fact that you're just hitting other people in the face? Well, you know, and as you know, we've talked about it before. It is an obvious part of it. I also think that it's more of a spectrum. I don't think that it is the same for every person or for every kind of version of the sport. For example, amateur boxing is very different from professional boxing, even in terms of like the rules that surround it. And then kind of speaking to some kind of like primal need to be aggressive or violent. I'm not sure. I think that when you are doing a sport, and when you've reached a level of expertise, it's not about the violence, it's about doing it well. And that's kind of what it comes down to. And I've experienced that to be very, to be universal in terms of the training, the experience of training in a gym. And then, you know, I know that there is the argument that's like, you know, what about Mike Tyson? What about, you know, all of that? And, you know, my work's not really about that. I'm not super interested in that, honestly. But you know, I recognize it as a level to the conversation, for sure. I don't have, you know, yeah, I think people do come to the gym to hit things, to hit other people, but not everybody, and not always for the same reasons, or not, you know, in the same context. And then, you know, the white collar thing is its own thing. I don't really think of that as part of the sport. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Bob, you get to wrap it up.
Well, I don't know if this is appropriate to wrap up, but did you know I was reminded of Emily Dickinson's line, hope is a feeling of feathers.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Woody Allen was without feathers. But would you want to comment on your choice to, you know, do beautiful work with the boxing gloves and feathers?
Oh, I think it's a great way to wrap it up. Go. Let's get some poetry in here. Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about it a little bit too over here, the choice of feathers. You know, I think James kind of touched on this, like explaining one's work can be kind of a sort of treacherous territory, because you know, it comes down to sort of doing it because you find yourself doing it. But that said, yes, I mean, I did, of course, I thought about kind of the aspects of, you know, the feathers as being very light, of course, and of there being that kind of, you know, back and forth. And then there's also kind of the idea of a pair for me, and then there was some of some of what Lucia talked about, the ethics of care, taking care of something, being very careful with it, and that is a big part of boxing, and that the gloves are for that. I mean, they're there to protect your hands, and on some level to protect the opponent. So that is its kind of paradoxical quality that I think can be found throughout the sport, and perhaps throughout kind of all of what we're talking about, is that it's never just one thing.
I think it's a great note to end on. Thanks everybody so much for coming out tonight, for the great questions, and really for helping make this event really, really lively. I very much appreciate it, and thank you. Have a great long weekend. We're still being videoed, so. Yeah, so Dave Ferguson. Yeah, James knew it. Yeah.
Yes, I walked it right after you finished. I had a 6 o'clock class. I came here. But I just wanted to hear you. I wanted to know.
Sorry we missed your talk, but
Thanks very much.